Welcome to episode 15 of the Sports Lawyers Association Sports Shorts. And I'm very happy to have as our guest today the General Counsel of the Pac-12 Conference, also known as the Conference of Champions, Maggy Carlyle, joining us today. So welcome, Maggy.
Thank you, Bobby. It's great to be here.
So first of all, as we like to start these things out, we know what your title is, but before we get to talking about your job, how did you wind your way to becoming the General Counsel of the Pac-12? And sort of what was your path to get there? And as sort of another part of it, especially for our law students, what guidance might you offer them with respect to things they might be studying if they wanted to get into the sports world, and particularly in college athletics where you are now, although your path hasn't always been there, as we'll soon learn from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll walk it back. I've been at the Pac-12 conference for a year as general counsel. Before that, I was associate general counsel of Pac-12. And technically it's called Pac-12 Enterprises. For all intents and purposes, it was Pac-12 Networks, which is the television networks that are owned and controlled by Pac-12 Conference. I was with them for 5 years. Before that, I worked at the San Jose Sharks in professional hockey for 5 seasons. I suppose you could call it 4.5, since one of those involved a lockout. And before that, was with the San Francisco 49ers for a year. And prior to that, NFL, which also included a lockout. So you will quickly get a theme for my career, which is not always that there is labor arrest in the path. And before that, my very first stop on the legal front was a legal internship at the Kansas City Chiefs. So I went to the University of Missouri for undergrad. I did Teach for America in between undergrad and law school, returned to the University of Missouri for law school for the first 2 years, and then ended up at Cardozo in New York while I was working at the NFL. So that was sort of the backwards, circuitous route. So while I have only been in college athletics at the very beginning of my career, I worked in the academic center, I played lacrosse, and also at the end of the current location of my career, I hope it's not the end, in the middle there, it was professional athletics, both hockey and football. So I've got a little taste of a lot of things, more to come hopefully.
And do you have any sort of general advice for we have a lot of law students that tend to get involved, and what recommendations do you have? I mean, obviously everybody has to take the core curriculum of law school, but what sort of courses would you recommend that they take if they want to find a spot in the sports world?
I mean, just do it all, right? I studied journalism in undergrad. I didn't do anything that really set me up logically for law school or for sports. But I played sports. I was always interested in sports. So in undergrad, I worked in the TV trucks. I volunteered in the TV trucks that was connected with journalism school. So I went and worked at football broadcast games in the TV trucks, literally carrying cords and being a gopher. Right. I worked and did like a 2-week stint. It felt like 2 weeks, actually may have been longer than that, at Learfield, which was at the time the college operations based in Jefferson City. So that was about 30 minutes away from Columbia at Mizzou. I went down there and worked on just putting together books for sales pitches. Learfield, for those of you who don't know, was and still is, although they merged or been acquired by IMG, do all the sports marketing for universities and do the sponsorships for many universities across the country. And so that was sort of a purview and a little glimpse into sports business. It had nothing to do with law. Again, when I went back to law school, I worked in the academic center at University of Missouri doing tutoring first, and then overseeing the English support system and overseeing the first year mentors. Again, nothing to do with law, but that broke into working with the compliance office there, and which essentially set the tone and set the resume for getting the internship at the Chiefs. So then, and when I applied for the internship at the Chiefs, y'all, I used to call November, December, January rejection season, because I got incredible advice my first year of law school from Betsy Goff, who was a lawyer for NBC Sports, who said, Maggie, if you want to work in sports, literally apply anywhere where you have a couch to sleep on. So I had sent my resume to locations all across the country. As it happened, I got calls back from 2 out of the 120 that I sent out. One of them was for the KC Wiz, which is a hilarious name. It was the predecessor to Sporting KC. And from the Kansas City Chiefs months later, from Woody Dixon, who was the general counsel there at the time, and was able to get an internship at the Chiefs for that summer, which I parlayed into a year-long internship and commuted back and forth between Columbia and Kansas City. So I was at that point in law school. By my second year of law school, I had done work with the athletic department, both in the academic center and in the compliance center. I'd done work for the Kansas City Chiefs, and through that experience got to meet and work with NFL lawyers in their grievances, and was able to get an offer for a clerkship at the NFL for the following year, which was for the summer, Bobby. And I remember I walked into Dave Gardy's office, who at the time worked for Management Counsel, around June or July, and I had just broken up with my boyfriend my second year of law school. So I was spending my summer there in New York and decided I wasn't going back. Told Dave, don't worry about hiring an extra clerk for the fall. I'm just going to stay on. Don't worry about it. And he said, oh, okay. And so I transferred to Cardozo, stayed on at the NFL, and have been working in some capacity in sports ever since. So I guess the takeaway for me is do lots of work, and do any opportunity that you can find to get experience.
So now you find yourself in the calm and static world of college sports. Nothing's going on. There's sort of just, oh wait, there was no season for a couple of years, and we're sort of getting back to that, one would hope, maybe. But let's talk about one big case, the most recent big case, which is Alston. And the Alston case, very simply, notwithstanding the wrench that Justice Kavanaugh threw into the whole mix, but very simply, it just says, NCAA, you can't control the academic awards that will be given out, the education-related expenses. Has anybody really thought to define what that means? I mean, what are educational expenses? How far does it go? And if the NCAA is in a position that has been told pretty much you can't make the call, it seems clear that individual institutions can. Are the conferences comfortable with making rules relating to those kinds of concerns?
Well, the conferences certainly can, right? And Alston has sort of reaffirmed that. I mean, it's really there's a lot in Alston, right? And there's so much to parse out. But one of the takeaways in Alston specifically, which is an interesting coincidence with the NIL rules, of course, but just in a vacuum, looking at Alston, what Alston doubles down on is that there is a recognized distinction between education-related benefits and non-education-related benefits, right? Now, the question is, how do you define it? Who defines it and how do you define it? We have been very told loud and clear that we can take it to the Northern District of California anytime we want to define it, and the court there can either confirm or deny how it's defined. You can apply the pornography test, and if you see it, you know it when you see it, which is kind of where we're at right now, I think. But I do think, I can certainly say that the conversations within the Pac-12 are around what does that mean? What is an education-related expense? And of course, what we also know coming out of Alston is that we can't talk to other conferences about it, right? The conferences are ourselves as autonomous conferences and distinct and competitive entities can talk about it, and our members can talk about it amongst themselves. And I, would assume that other conferences are doing the same. At this point, there is no, the Pac-12 itself has not decided to write down and codify exactly what an education-related expense means for multiple reasons, including the fact that Alston's not just in a vacuum. We're also dealing with the addition and change of the NIL rules, but also because it's the add on to the complexity of the Alston decision, the fact that people forget it doesn't apply to all college athletics, right? It only applies to the class in Alston, which is football and men's and women's basketball. And so to the extent that Alston has conferred benefits, and I sort of shiver at that perception, because I just think it has redefined what those benefits may be to certain student athletes. Right now, it only applies to football players and men's and women's basketball players. Now, do I think that'll stand? No. But it also, begs the question, which is, what is an education-related benefit as it applies to that class, which involves between 15 and 25 women and 135 to 150 men, which creates a whole other issue and complexity with the Title IX interaction with figuring out what benefits may be available to football and basketball players versus the rest of the student athlete population. So that is a very circuitous way and illustration of how complex the application of Alston really is. But there is a very clear definition of what education-related benefits are in terms of specifying examples in Alston. And right now, that's sort of the guiding light, which is, all right, here are the things that are education-related benefits. They include academic paid internships. It includes scholarship monies, not just for the institution itself, but also post-eligibility scholarship monies, scholarships to vocational schools and other institutions, not only the scholarship granting institution, equipment, violins, computers, whatever, cameras for photography class and the like. And that's sort of where people are standing now. Now we know that where there's if you could give a mouse a cookie, is that it? Yeah, you give a mouse a cookie. He's gonna, they're gonna take it as far as they can, and they filed house. And following the Alston decision, the plaintiffs filed leave to amend, and they've consolidated and they've amended to challenge the remaining NIL related limitations that have been conferred by the NCAA. But what we do know very loud and clear is the NCAA and the conferences are subject to full antitrust scrutiny, and we will conduct ourselves as such going forward.
Well, I think that raises the next point. You sort of led into it. A lot of people, I think, believe that Alston was an NIL case, which it isn't, but it definitely leads into what are name, image, and likeness rights and how to deal with them. I think one of the biggest concerns that I've expressed often, and my biggest concern is what are, for example, if you can talk about it, what is your conference doing with respect to working with the schools in the conference to educate the student athletes? And part of that question is also, notwithstanding the facts that Alston deals with 3 groups of athletes, how can you not deal with, the other 26 sports on some of the campuses? So is the conference moving ahead with a general educational program for all student athletes?
Yeah, so to your point, right, NIL is actually separate and apart from Alston altogether. Now, it's addressed in the next antitrust case. It's already been filed in-house in Oliver. But every student athlete is able to monetize his and her NIL. And there are distinctions between states at the moment. So some student athletes in certain states can monetize them in different ways than others. But under the new NCAA rules and each state law where there is and where there is not, different student athletes are able to monetize their NILs. And right now, the universities are really taking charge of the educational programs, right? And all of them are, right? Not only because they recognize that it is a benefit to their student athletes that they are now able to monetize their NIL, but also because, I mean, you and I had a conversation yesterday. A lot of these folks are brand new with this, right? And there's a lot of components that student athletes want help and direction on, including like how to deal with finances, how to find and retain an agent, how to assess an agent, because they're allowed to use agents for their NIL purposes, which frankly I think is a good thing for all intents and purposes. But there's also, I think, at least from a personal standpoint, I think there's a risk of over paternalization, right? Which is this saying that student athletes are out there and then now they're all at risk. They're going to be preyed upon. They don't know how to, handle these contracts. They don't know how to handle these deals. They don't know how to handle this money. Well, I think that first of all, most of the monies that we're talking about for most of the student athletes are not, we're talking huge sums, right? Most student athletes are not going to make millions of dollars. And by the way, I think that's an okay thing. I don't think that minimizes the importance of everybody being able to do it, right? Like, I don't know about you, but $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in my pocket when I was in school is a big deal, right? Like that's rent. That's, a Saturday night. That's, being able to buy books and put gas in the car. That's a big deal. But at the same time, it's not as a sizable risk in the sense that we're dealing with, $20 million or 20-year, $100 million deals on a regular basis. And I would argue that not unlike sports gaming, there was risk before NIL was legal, right? Of exploitation of, in the highest visibility sense, right? Basketball players and in the federal investigation around, the basketball scandal, which is that this is, to a certain extent, this has happened previously in an illegal sense, in an unsanctioned sense, and there was always that risk. Now, do we want our student athletes to be educated and be able to be empowered to know how to do this and do it well? Yeah, absolutely. And from the conference level, a lot of it is our compliance folks who are amazing, helping and supporting the university and the institution compliance folks figure out exactly what you asked at the beginning, which is what are education related benefits? What do these NIL rules mean? Because it's not all open season. There are still limits right now that are, being challenged in House and Oliver that have been imposed by the NCAA, which say NIL is totally cool, go for it, except that, universities, boosters, and others can't use NIL in a way for improper recruiting inducement for pay-for-play, right? So our compliance folks deal with how our universities can navigate that. But there's also, our universities are providing on many levels, finance courses, agents, sort of assessment and structure, which they did honestly before, as folks were preparing for drafts. They would come in, bring in agents, work with PAs in the pro leagues to bring in and help support students to assess agents and choose agents as they were leaving the university. So they've really just pivoted that and expanded that to deal with current student athletes who now have a new fun toy to work with.
Is there a general consensus in the Pac-12 and to the extent about other conferences to mandate that there are no use of school marks in the NIL program, or is that on a school by school basis?
Yeah, at this point, from the Pac-12 conference standpoint, I don't know what other conferences' policies are, but I have not heard of any specific policies from other conferences. There is no mandate from the middle, from the center, from the conference, that, universities have to use or disallow their marks in any way. Now, from a compliance standpoint, this is where I get way out of my depth. And if Eric Price and Chris Marino listen to this, they're probably just like holding their breath. But I'll try to do their jobs for them real quickly. From a compliance standpoint, right? Their whole purview is, student athletes should be treated the way that students are treated. And so to the extent that students can use and access and license university marks or athletics marks or otherwise, student athletes should be given those and afforded those opportunities in a comparable way. As I understand it, there are some universities that are able and willing to license their marks to the student athletes, and there are others that are not. And at this point, it's a university by university decision. We're not mandating that. The conference itself, as it happens, we own and we control Pac-12 networks. And so the Pac-12 networks has made available and will be making available the licensing of various clips and highlights to student athletes, partners and sponsor partners and otherwise, in the same way that Pac-12 networks licenses to everybody, right? And so there are ways and there's structures really that have always been in place that are now just able to be accessed by student athletes for the first time.
Part of my concern with athletes using school marks is I understand that if they're that's a license, so the school's going to get some money too. So in a certain level, you create an ancillary income for the university, ancillary income for the conference. Is there concern that it will impede or impinge upon broader rights that the conference has with advertisers? For example, the advertiser would say, use the influencer model and say, well, rather than paying for commercials on a Pac-12 network programming, I'm just going to pay, Mary Jo, the swimmer, I'm going to pay her 20 grand to put it up on Instagram and I'll get better traction that way.
I mean, I don't know if that's a concern. You just added this is economics conversation, right? So you just added new folks to the marketplace. And, frankly, I don't think, I can't speak to the past, but I can speak from my own sort of personal opinion and my personal stance, which is, I'm sure there will be marketers out there who find more value going directly to a certain student athlete than they would from the conference or from the university itself. That said, I actually don't think, and I don't personally have a fear, and again, right, I'm not Maggy Carlyle, head of sales, and Maggy Carlyle, general counsel, so take whatever I say with a grain of salt. The marketers that find value with Pac-12 conference and the marketers that find value with Pac-12 networks can be the same marketers, but there's a different value from having an individual student athlete or an individual athlete as a promoter and as a spokesperson than having an alignment with a larger organization or a larger company, right? And we see it all the time. We see it all the time, individuals who are students right now, who are musicians, who are who are actors and actresses who go to colleges. And in the pro leagues, right, you have a lot of sponsors who sponsor a professional team and get signage and assets that are in a stadium, in a venue, in an arena, on TV, that our student athletes and professional athletes at the professional levels don't have access to those assets, right? It's just a different marketing scheme. It's sometimes, you access folks in a different way, in the same way that the conference doesn't have an individual face. We never have been able to, right? And one of the sort of ironic conversations we're having with our sales folks is, there's a lot of conversation around NIL, but not a lot changes for our sales team, because our sales team couldn't license the NIL of student athletes before for our corporate partners. Like our corporate partners couldn't just plug in a Marcus Mariota, quip into their commercial whenever he was the quarterback at Oregon. And they can't do it now because we don't have the rights to Marcus Mariota's or, any other current student athletes' rights to do that. So to the extent that, there may be like a deficit to the conference or any institution, I think it'll be de minimis. I truly think that folks will just find, maybe the market will that they're taking from is the individual sponsor market. Maybe they compete with professional athletes more or other folks more, but I don't think it'll be a strong competition between the institutions themselves, the companies themselves, the conferences or the NCAA, and the individuals.
So I think at last count, there were maybe 10 states that had NIL legislation. I think California.
More than that. Or that are live. Maybe you're right.
Yeah, that are live.
Yeah.
And there's legislation pending, but that are actually in place. And I believe California has accelerated NIL to September 1. it's interesting. California was the first to pass legislation, had an effective date of 2023. So all they had to do was file amicus briefs and let everybody else fight. Kind of a great strategy.
That's right. It worked out well for them.
So if you have 10 or maybe last count, I knew 12 live NIL statutes on the books, what about the other 40 states? What's really going on? How much energy is being pushed by the conferences to, Washington to say we need national legislation?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question, because I think that prior to the NCAA rule, there was a huge push, right? Because then you had real distinct differences. Now, I mean, I will caveat this by saying there are still some real distinct differences from the state to state when they're in the laws that they have. But the NCAA did create a rule effective July 1 that said that, essentially all student athletes in all states can monetize their third party NIL. Now, you heard me slyly say their third party NIL, meaning that the NCAA rule limits what universities and those affiliated with universities can do. And so, I think that what you have left now is a level playing field that is created by this NCAA emergency legislation, and with divots in a few residual states, California, Michigan, New Mexico, a few others, that have sort of more or different levels and different laws than the NCAA rules allow. And I think that does create some uncertainty. It creates some real angst amongst the universities, and especially conferences like ours, right? Where you have different states in the same footprint, in the same conference, that have very different state laws. And the universities have to, figure out how they're different and how to comply with them, those laws. Also, how to comply and navigate the NCAA rules as it applies and interacts with those state laws. And then also, compete on the field and on the court and in the pool with different schools who deal with different state laws. And so it is, I think that the schools themselves are very supportive of a national sort of standard. There's a lot that goes on with that, obviously, and the nuances and considerations of what happens with a federal law or a national standard for NIL. But I think that there is an appetite for it because of exactly what you just pointed out, which is that, our schools in Washington don't have a state law that is in effect. And in fact, I think, that they would be, concerned if the NCAA hadn't passed a rule, and all of a sudden California schools can, in their minds, off the world, and the Washington schools couldn't. But now that you have an NCAA rule, it kind of sets the standard about what this looks like, right? And I think that, I wasn't part of the consideration, the conversation with the national folks, and there was, it has taken many years to get to where we are. But I think there is consideration, especially in the wake of Alston, which came out about a week and a half before the NIL rule came into effect, of how that interacts too, right? And how do we maintain what is special and unique about college athletics and still navigate this world of third-party NIL?
So we don't have a lot of time left, and I have a million questions, and I will bring you back to sports shorts and other SLA events, but you
didn't say I was signing up for more, Bobby. Come on.
Everybody signs up for more. There's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and we have to talk about it. Conference realignment. Oklahoma and Texas jump into the SEC. You look at it, and I'm a TV guy, right? So I look at it and I say, so these networks paid for a lot of money, relatively, for the Big 12 conference. And the two cherries on top of that college sundae are gone, which means that all those member institutions are going to be clearly, if I were a betting man, be making less money on their next TV deal. The SEC, on the other hand, signed their $3 billion deal with ESPN starting in 2024. They just made it better by bringing in those other schools. Is there pressure on the Pac-12 to, reach out to BYU or a Mountain West school or whatnot? And in light of all of this, is there going to be another move of conference realignment like we had several years ago? And overall, where does this leave the NC2A?
I think that what you may not have told people who are watching this is that I'm currently in the airport, which is given the wind situation. I'm waiting for a plane. That's why I have a glass of wine in my hand. I had to prepare myself for this. I will be leaving now, Bobby. It was nice to talk to you. No, and in all seriousness, to your first question, because there were about 4 couched in there, and I will try to remember what they were. I think that what we know historically in very short history, all right, in the very realignment's been happening for the last 40 years. In the last 15 years, we've seen that when you have 2 schools from a major conference go to another major conference, it triggers a domino effect, and it has triggered a domino effect historically, which is why folks ask the question, oh, what's going to happen, right? Like, who's moving where? Because we know that this is going to trigger a huge domino effect. It's interesting to me because I can, with full sincerity, say there is no pressure on the Pac-12 to add members, and in fact, I don't know if there is pressure on other conferences. I don't know. I can't speak to that, but there is clearly we are focused on watching what's happening, right? And we're not, the commissioner has stated this publicly, and it's truly what is taking place, which is the Pac-12 is not out there recruiting members to add, right? And I don't know whether other conferences are. I wouldn't be surprised if they were. I wouldn't be.
Well, folks, looks like we have a technical difficulty unless Maggie comes back. The wind may have put an end to her participation. Right at the moment where we were really going to hit.
For you, can you not hear me?
Oh, you froze.
Oh, am I back?
Now you're back.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'll try. I don't know where you lost me, but what we've seen over the last 20 years and what has happened over the last 20 years in the creation of the autonomy conferences is it really has whittled, which is, again, no surprise when people are talking about it, an autonomy conference structure with institutions that more or less belong in that autonomy conference structure, which is primarily football strength. It also includes women's basketball strength in terms of the amount of eyeballs and fans who watch those sports. And, the question really is, who belongs in a conference and why? And the SEC aside, which, I think the SEC is the same, right? Which is, there are obvious reasons why the SEC would want Texas and would want Oklahoma, especially given their structure. And they have created a brand of strong football, sort of a Southern stranglehold. But that said, it's hard to imagine a total realignment of the conferences as they exist now, in my mind, and maybe you'll call me in 2 weeks and laugh at me in naivete, because while we all bemoan the loss of regionalism and we're all going to move to one super conference, there really is truly still some regionalism, right? In terms of how conferences and how universities interplay. There is history amongst rivals, and we've seen some loss of rivals, right? And some re-engagement of rivals. You see at the SEC, one of the and I truly believe this, right? Like, Texas is an institution in and of itself, and it has a value in and of itself that is unrivaled. But Texas A&M and Texas, and the loss of that rivalry was shocking to folks in Texas, right? And shocking to folks in the Big 12 and in the nation. And those mean something. And it's I don't think it's a surprise or a shock to anybody that Texas A&M was among the first to say something whenever Texas was coming over. Like, they're truly rivals, regardless of whether they're playing each other on the field or not. They still mean something, right? And so I think that what you're gonna see is because it also coincides with this constitutional convention the NCAA has called, and people really taking a deep dive and a look. The Knight Commission in the recent year talking about the sustainability of the NCAA model. What does an Autonomy 5 conference structure separate and apart from other D1 conferences look like? What a D1 football, basketball conferences look like versus D2 and D3? Does it make sense for them to be governed in the same way? And I mean, to be frank, the NCAA recognizes this sort of existential crisis too, which is why they themselves call this constitutional convention to look at the structure. But the conferences themselves are talking, we're talking about it as well, because we recognize that we are at a influx in the way that college athletics works. Again, from a personal standpoint, I really hope college athletics continues, because it's not all football and basketball, right? And maybe they're organized and governed in different ways, and it's probably they will be in a certain respect, and already they kind of are in certain respects as well. But we have 23 sports, right? And we have over 7,000 student athletes in the Pac-12 alone, and 150 of them play football and basketball. And the rest of them are really, we are not, you're high visibility, high revenue sports always, although when you watch the Olympics, you see the impact of college athletics in the United States model of feeding Olympic athletes. I'll brag on the Pac-12 a little bit. If we were a country, we would have had the 5th most medals in these Olympics, which is awesome. It's freaking awesome, right? We have amazing swimmers, we have amazing gymnasts. And if we're not careful, we're gonna really, really hinder those student athletes and the abilities and their access to those opportunities. And those aren't just white sports. I'm gonna throw that out there, right? You see whenever you lose track and field, you see whenever you lose other sports, that it affects Black and brown student athletes as well. Which we also want to keep in mind. But all that to say, I don't think that the NCAA, I don't think the college athletics, I don't think the Autonomy 5 is going to look the way it looks today in a couple of years. And I think the NCAA acknowledges that. That's why they are sort of having the exercise they're going into right now.
Well, Maggie, there's so much more I could talk to you about. We haven't touched on the future of the NC2A. I haven't even had a chance to get into Title IX, which I think ties into all of these issues that we've been talking about. The implications of the NIL and the academic, the money that students can use and the things they can get, without even touching on Title IX, which is sort of an important issue as we approach next year on the 50th anniversary of Title IX. There's a lot
sort
more
of
to
a huge issue. It's a great issue. We'll have a whole other hour on that,
buddy. You have witnesses. So this has really been really great, really interesting. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Everybody, thank you for joining today. Don't forget, if you want more than just sports shorts and virtual outreach events, and actually a real outreach event that's going on in Chicago this Friday evening, and webinars and our annual conference, which will be next May, assuming we don't get to the Delta Epsilon, whatever beyond that, we can all meet in purpose. Please go to sportslaw.org and become a member of the Sports Lawyers Association. And signing off for today, Maggy Carlyle, you've been a joy to interview today. Thanks for telling us so many interesting things. We got more to talk about. And thank you again. Travel safely, everybody. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Bobby.